The next topic is articulation and sound. Now, of course, I mean, in future lessons, we could spend a whole hour on this, but just a couple details that I'd like to share with you in your own, to help you in your own study of Bach. I strongly recommend to get original manuscripts of things as much as possible. You'll see now, especially if you look on IMS, and on Naxos and all these things, and look for the sheet music online. There are two different ways to get the sheet music for Bach. You can get an edition which has dynamic markings and slur markings and all these things. But remember that those are not what Bach put in. Those are what the editor, sometimes a modern editor, put in. Sometimes you'll see editions that have the designation urtext or URTEXT, and that is an edition that is trying to match the original composer's intent as closely as possible. Sometimes it will even be facsimiles of original manuscripts. Why is that important? Because Bach put a lot of marks on his part. He didn't add dynamics because that wasn't customary at the time, but slurs and slashes and tenuto markings or little dots or little scratchings, all these different things that can indicate to us things about phrasing, things about articulation. So I would recommend really studying the original manuscript. You can get a little bit more of a spirit, how he groups 16th notes, how he groups them together, which ones are clumped together and which ones are spread apart. That can give you some ideas on things. Okay, I want to pull up the slur exercise because one of the things comes up, how much do we pay attention to the bow? The bow in a string player is so much of their sound, so much of their articulation. And we should definitely be cognizant of that. And we can go crazy thinking about the bow. You definitely should watch string players play. The way they put pressure over their bridge really helps us understand when to put pressure and when to apply weight. So if they're going to go boom ba dee da, whatever they're doing, it's going to indicate to us a little bit more how we should phrase and articulate those sounds. I would just like to give you one kind of quickie, and that is that if you have a slur marking, one way to make that obvious is to emphasize the first note of the slur. So you have this example, use a little harder mallets for this, down here. Okay, and I was over exaggerating it, but you can put a little bit of emphasis on the beginning of where the slur markings are. Now, that's kind of a quick trick. If you're like, okay, there's these slur markings, I don't know how to make them come out. That's kind of a quick trick to give you some ideas about it, because that will help give some phrasing and articulation to the note. The other thing is this concept of legato and staccato stroke, which maybe you remember we talked about with Blue Memories, but that can also help too. So in the case of this example, if I have these first four notes as sort of a more staccato stroke, and then I emphasize the beginning of the slur, and then come out of it with the so-called legato stroke or wrists up, it's going to change the sound quite a bit, and the end result will be something like this. It changes it completely. All of a sudden I hear phrasing. I don't hear just, and that's important. So the combination of how you indicate slurs by maybe emphasizing the first note of them and this legato and staccato stroke can be super important for it. The third thing, simple trick to get an idea of it, for articulation and sound, is know the open strings on the violin and the cello. That's very, very important. On the violin, the open strings are G, D, A, and E. So if you have a long note on one of those, I mean, that string player is going to go to town on those. Open strings, are so much fun to play as a string player. They tend to be the most in tune because they're an open string, and they're great landing points. So be aware of that because that can affect your sticking and things like that. So, and your articulation. Okay, let's move on to sticking, which is the next topic that we have to always think about. And let's pull up the hand-to-hand PDF. I'm going to give you some examples here of ways to approach sticking. There's no right or wrong in terms of rules for sticking, but I'd like to have you think about one example with 3 different kinds of sticking. And again, these are on your PDF, so if you don't want to write them down or forget. So the first is we can play anything hand-to-hand, so-called, or alternating. So I'm going to show you what this exercise looks like this way. So what I'm doing is those 30-second note runs, just alternating those. So of course, that's always a viable option. But two other things to consider is, what if you were to do that all with one hand? Make sure I'm playing the right notes. It changes it. Or yeah, I mean, kind of interesting. The third way, and maybe it's affects tempo too, is to do all alternating with one hand. So that would be, sorry. Actually, I kind of like that one. You may think at first, wow, that's really weird to do for it, but it's something. It's sort of interesting the way it affects the phrasing. So anyway, those are just three things that you can use. You can always go hand to hand. You can always do one hand at a time, one mallet. It could be inside or outside. Or that also, alternating within a hand, very, very effective and will change the sound. So you should always think about different things. Again, open strings are going to matter. That's going to affect this as well. Okay, I have just a couple more things to tell you, but I want to get questions in. So now's the time to start thinking about questions that you might have for me. If you think below, right below the video is going to be that question box, so you can kind of think about that. Okay, just a couple of other things, and I know, just a lot of information, but the other thing that we have to think about is our rolls. Rolls become very, very important because it is our only way to sustain a note on the marimba. And there are different kinds of rolls. If we do traditional rolls, we can play them fast or slow. You can also change your wrist height. Big change in the sound. There are other kinds of rolls, and one of the rolls that Lee Howard Stevens talks about in his book, that's a roll that people tend to do. He calls it a tickle roll. Some people call it a touch roll. Some people call it a soft roll. Some people call it a sustain roll. There's all different kinds. And that is where you get the bar going and you roll just enough so that the sound continues to sustain. Now that initial attack doesn't have to be loud. But the idea is that you don't hear the individual beats at all. So to kind of show you a little bit of what that sounds like, let's pull up the cello prelude. This is the first movement of Suite Number 2, and I'll just play just a little bit of it. The concept is that we want to be very careful of when rolls sound like marimba rolls, and be very cognizant of that. We don't want them to sound like marimba rolls. We want them to sound like sustain. So this is a good example of when you might want to use that tickle roll or touch roll. And there on the high note, I might use a more traditional roll just to add a little tension in it. I maybe want those beats in the sound a little bit. So again. Thing I'll mention is that sometimes with Bach, I think is really effective to completely take your grip off the mallet. There's something about that that just gets less articulation, more of the roundness and depth and resonance of the bar. Okay, so that's kind of the deal with rolls. The only other thing about rolls that I'll say is know your instrument. You have to roll every note on your instrument to know how it responds, because if I roll this speed, I can get that tickle roll going. If I move to the note right next to it, I can hear the beats in that. So because of just the nature of the two different bars, I would want to speed that one up just a little bit. So, spend time with your instrument, know every single note. You know the violinists do, you know the cellists do also.